It was like 1 in 8 students have diagnosed mental health problem. And then with, if we think about those suboptimal levels, it is going to be much more. It might not be clinically diagnosed or might not even have the opportunity to be clinically diagnosed.
Welcome to the Braemar Life Skills Academy podcast, where we'll explore the evolving world of education and student well-being. I'm your host, Mike Helsby, and in Season 2, we're focused on personal well-being, self-regulation, and innovative learning strategies for school and everyday life. Whether you're an educator, parent, student, or education thinker, this podcast is for you. Join us for insightful discussions, valuable perspectives, and a fresh look at the future of learning. Let's take that step into the future of education together. Welcome back to the Braemar Life Skills Academy Season 2. I'm your host, as always, Mike Helsby, and today we are kicking off our Season 2 cycle on resilience with a very special guest, Dr. Suna Madswamuse. Dr. Suna has been an Associate Professor of Human Development, Learning, and Culture in the Department of Education at UBC since 2022. Before that, she was a faculty member at the University of Brighton in the School of Sport and Health Sciences. There she served as the Deputy Director of the Center for Resilience for Social Justice since 2017. Her current research focuses on understanding the risks and protective mechanisms associated with youth development and well-being. She uses longitudinal methodologies in order to transfer knowledge into practice by designing and testing resilience-focused early intervention strategies through their program development and evaluation phases. Today, she'll be helping to orient us in the fast-growing field of research and describing what conclusions and possible routes forward we might be gleaning from her work in it. Dr. Suna, thank you so much for joining me and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today.
Now, I should preface this by saying Dr. Suna and I have been on a little adventure of our own over the last half hour or so, trying to get all the tech set up to bring you this episode. We are hosted today by the UBC studios. As any of you who've ever hosted a podcast are surely well aware of, the tech doesn't always cooperate in the way we want it to, but I am feeling increasingly at ease, hoping, and maybe the listeners can hope along with us, that everything goes according to plan the rest of the way. Dr. Suna, you've had your own set of adventures arriving here at UBC in the past several years, many stops along the way informing your work with resilience. If you could please just sort of introduce yourself to the listeners, let them know what you've been through and what's informed this focus for you.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I'm actually going to start from from very early in my life, where I was born in Germany to an immigrant family at a time where educational segregation of foreign students were still very much in place. So when I came to school age, it was a decision whether I'm going to continue school in Germany or I'll go back to Turkey, where my family is originally from. So with all the effort of my mom to put me in a mainstream school, which wasn't successful at the end. So I was sent to Turkey with my grandparents. And suddenly, I became not anymore an immigrant minority student, but a member of a mainstream population, where still we're talking about, rural, low resource areas, but I always tell this story because I think it's very much informs what I'm doing today and my perspective to the field, but also clearly shows that in one context, I would have suffered, potentially low chances of being successful or doing what I want to do in life, or even if I achieve them, suffer from other consequences of that work. Whereas in another context, I became one of the first university educated member of my extended family, and I'm here today. So I think it's an important it's illustration of to see the context matters.
Certainly.
And so then just moved to university years. So I started my life as in educational sciences, trained as a school counselor. And then moved to so with my interest more on understanding, to support young people in schools, we really need to understand their development, where they're coming, their past, their future, what is that life cycle looks like for young people. From their point of view. So in the long story short, really here. So I decided to learn more about developmental work. So I moved to developmental psychology, so human development, where I studied my PhD, while also doing that more from counseling point of view. And after that, having my PhD on adolescents and young people, I was very much interested in understanding the early years. So what are the risks and what are the mechanisms that protects us later in life that we bring from early years, which made me to move more around, from human development to psychology of early years. Where I studied a lot about pregnancy, prematurity, and then early life experiences, attachment to later school readiness, and later, adult life as well, much later on. This is actually where I realized every time I do research and explore some data, I constantly say, it is about our early experiences. It is about what we do as individuals, but it is also about what is context, what is our systems around us, the family, the schools are offering us, what are the resources. It's not just about our skills to access to those resources, it's also the availability of resources, so the impact of the environment, which very much moved me to understand where the exploring the risk and protective mechanisms rather than in the individual, in the environment around the individuals, which means going to public health approach, really, and bringing all of them together, really. So now I'm at my work really focuses on understanding somewhere in between person and environment, that process, that interaction in between, to look at how that interaction process helps us thrive individually, but also as a community, as a group, as a school, as a family, as a neighborhood.
There's so many different pieces there, and I think this is one of the things that sort of stops people in their tracks when they begin their understanding of this concept of resilience. There are biological factors at play from the prenatal stages on through your early childhood. Of course, there's these many cultural forces at play, like those you expressed, being born in Germany. There were some, I think, cultural barriers there that you had to be overcome, perhaps some language barriers, especially for family. And as you said, some systemic issues there with segregation in the education system. So all of these forces swirling around us, having various levels of influence on our state of well-being, as I said, can prevent people from really diving deeper into this field and understanding their own situation vis-a-vis resilience. So I'm hoping to sort of zoom out here for a second so that we can zoom back in. What do we mean on a foundational level by the words well-being and then, of course, resilient? How can we best conceptualize this notion of thriving, or even it seems like resilience is a sort of thriving through adverse forces? And where might people best be served in evaluating their own status vis-a-vis well-being and resilience? And what might they turn to first in terms of establishing a baseline of well-being? So these big questions, really. I know we're gonna get into more detail in a few minutes, but
they are very important questions, and I think is the right place to start thinking about really understanding resilience, but also well-being, especially in our current, where the literature and the area is currently, because they're both complex concepts, complex to indicate, complex to observe, but at the same time with their key characteristics being really straightforward, universal. They are complex. Let's start from there. They're complex. Well-being. Let's start from well-being. Well-being is a complex concept to define, to understand, to observe, to indicate, because it changes across time. Being a student wellness 25 years ago and student wellness today are different experiences. And it changes after big policy changes. I mean, if we think about high school being mandatory, compulsory, I'm talking about 100 years ago for some countries, 10 years ago for some other countries. So that's a big change as well in terms of how we define wellness. And it changes, of course, from culture to context. And it also changes what else is going on in child's life, in young person's life, not just about what their experiences are in school. And most importantly, I guess, it's the developmental stage, whether we're talking about primary school students, secondary school students, high school students, they're all have an influence in terms of how we measure, how we observe wellness, well-being. But on the other hand, I think there are at least 3-4 key characteristics that are consistent regardless of all these variations. And this is kind of me bringing different perspectives from different fields I was part of. One of them is really very much, Carl Rogers' humanistic perspective in therapy world, bringing that holistic approach to understand the individual child, student. Mm-hmm. So looking at not just from, if we talk about in the educational context, not just about, their academic success or behavior, but what else is happening in that child's life. So having that holistic approach, holistic wellness. So that's one aspect. So bringing from Rogers' perspective. The other one is a little bit positive psychology, a little bit new dimension, new work in medical world, more in psychiatry world, is we're not just talking about lack of problems. That's part of it, wellness. So we don't have any emotional baggage or challenges in life, or not showing any symptoms. But it's also the having some positive emotions, positive aspects to our wellness. So it's a dual model. It's just not having any problems is not an indication of wellness. It has to be more than that. It has to be more promotive of next steps in our lives. So that's the other aspect. And I think the third one is that, again, universal, regardless of time and context or situation in terms of defining wellness, comes from public health perspective. It's really difficult to talk about individual wellness without talking about the wellness of the community they're in or the system they are in. If they're very much interlinked, mm-hmm. So we need to understand that link as well. So in that sense, this is kind of where I'm defining wellness, well-being in relation to young people. How resilience comes to this is, so what I just described is the definition of conceptualization of the well-being. What promotes well-being is a different question. What helps to build well-being or promote well-being, or keep it in more satisfied levels. So these are, we have enormous list of mechanisms that support our well-being or well-functioning, from healthy parenting, good relationships in school belongingness. So we can list a number of things, which we can talk about them later as well, the key ones. But where resilience comes in is really when those factors, mechanisms promoting our well-being becomes protective of the individual against something else, against a challenge. They're all good. Health, good enough parenting, or having a school belongingness. They're all good for everyone. They will all improve our well-being, life satisfaction, or functioning, regardless of anything else. But when they become, have a one step further more role in our life as protecting us against a challenge we're experiencing, this is when we're talking about resilience. Because of existence of these protective mechanisms, a young person is doing better than expected in that situation. That's what we talk about there, resilience, in terms of if we compare to resilience and well-being. And I think that's a key difference that we need to, there's always a discussion about whether, how linked or different resilience and well-being. In terms of what happens in real life, they are very similar. But in terms of what the role of those factors, those supports, those resources in our life, are they helping us or are they protecting us? That's when resilience and well-being separates.
That's a very clear way to think of it, helping versus protecting. It does seem, in my own experience with education psychology and my own burgeoning research, that much of what's going on in these fields today has to do with accepting complexity, almost like this humble step back from what in the past would have been an act of trying to categorize and divide and make these clear cause-effect linear relationships stand out from the research. Whereas what I've heard from you is a real appreciation for the swirling, ever in process, iterative nature of some of these concepts, that well-being and resilience are not one thing, but are rather the constant being informed by multiple forces that act on us, and that we can't simply prescribe, for example, a student is unwell because checklist item 1, checklist item 2, checklist item 3, but rather we need to, as you said in Carl Rogers' approximation, look at the whole being, look at the functioning of the whole being in context of family, community, environment, finances, culture, language, etc. And that is
what happened before even coming to school, or what's going to happen after school.
Yeah, what is happening in the body, what is happening in the digestion, what is happening in friendships. It's all contributory, isn't it? I want to get to a point, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those individual pieces and perhaps whether there is a hierarchy of influence. Are some of these forces acting more powerfully than others? But I want to zoom in on something you said earlier about the past 25 years and the changes that have taken place in the past 25 years. My impression, however in its early stages it may be, is that there has been a deterioration in observed well-being, especially in young people, over the past 25 years, and perhaps even in the more immediate term in the past 3 or 4 years. We can talk about the specific reasons for that. But what have you seen in your lived experience of those 25 years as a student, as a researcher, and now as a professor who's looking more deeply into the causes of these states during that time period?
No, that's very true, and it is with young people, especially 10 to 16 years olds, between 10 to 16 years olds. Mental health problems, anxiety and depression, and problems related to those are becoming an important public health issue. It's the latest numbers that I was able to follow. I think it came from a couple of years ago. It was like 1 in 8 students have diagnosed mental health problem, and then with if we think about those suboptimal levels, it is going to be much more. It might not be clinically diagnosed or might not even have the opportunity to be clinically diagnosed. So that means that is true if you look around or with our own experiences, our interactions with students, and in the schools as well. I think there are multiple reasons contributing to this issue. One of them, of course, now these topics are not taboo anymore. So we're talking, there's more information, there's more knowledge, we're identifying more. That's one thing that, a lot it is said in the past, and I still agree, but only one aspect of many other reasons. The other one is very much related to what you said earlier. There have been a lot of intervention applied work developed in the past 2 decades, even more, but with a reductionist, linear cause and effect model, like directly what I'm doing will have a direct impact on that specific outcome that I'm interested in. I was, 20 years ago, I was part of those, both development and practicing those interventions. I was part of that movement as well. But what I'm realizing is with a lot of benefits, but we also have a lot of harm with these programs, because if you think about a student coming to school, they're not just there with their motivation or with their, as a student to learn in that class. They bring everything with them: their biology, as you said, their history, their family, the streets they walk through, and what's going to happen after the school or on the weekend. So they're there as a whole individual. And what we are trying to do is, with those interventions, just pick up one aspect of that individual and change that without thinking of what else, what impact it's going to make to other aspects of that individual system. Yeah. And that's most of the time, those who already have resources, already doing well, benefit a lot from those programs, those interventions. But those who are struggling in life for all sorts of reasons will actually get more negative impact of those interventions, or not has any impact at all, because they are not fitting well. They're not. So that also increased the gap between those who are disadvantaged and those, doing okay or, mainstream in schools. And we know that, when such gaps increases, if you think about the inequalities gap, the impact of inequalities gap in the, lives of people, that also influences the well-being of everyone, not just the disadvantaged, everyone. Mm-hmm. So that's another aspect. And the third one is really, it's not easy to be a young person this age. That's true. Most likely this was true, if we ask, someone from 1900, 1800, 19th century, they'll say the same thing, but this is also true now. With all the availability of the information, being exposed to everything that used to be, exposed when you were a little bit older, just because of lack of technology, or, we're now in the information age, they are dealing with big issues when they're still preparing to be dealing with them, rather than, being an adult. We're adultifying young people with all the responsibilities of, some of them might be ready, but some of them may not be, and that's okay. Yeah. And that's another aspect. They're all aware of, everything else. Even global, climate change, all the wars happening now. They are fully aware of that. Mm-hmm. That's not easy. I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't be. That's not, and I don't want to be misunderstood. That's the reality of today. Yeah. But that's the impact it's making as well. And the last one I want to mention is really our expectations of young people now has changed. Their expectations of themselves has changed. And that's necessarily, it's a transition period, and that's why it's not clear so that's another anxiety driving, they're constantly living in an anxiety driving environment at family, at school. And so then it's unavoidable to have those problems.
Yeah.
The challenges, though, if you look at from more population level, we know that, this is evidenced by multiple research. Those problems that are happening starting in early age will continue in adulthood. So we can't, even though they get support, 50% of adult mental health problems are emerging between 10 to 16 years old.
Wow. I just want to make sure I've understood that 50% of diagnoses?
Adult life diagnosis actually, it started. So when they go back, they realize the onset of the problems are, at the ages of between the ages of 10 and 16 years old. So if you develop any problem between 10 and 16, you're likely to have that problem continuously in your life.
And so whereas we might intuitively think of the school environment as the place best suited to identify these issues arising in the lives of 10 to 16-year-olds and be able to, in some sort of coordinated fashion, prevent, provide support, intervene, it sounds like that's not happening in the way that it needs to.
Yeah, definitely. So the most feasible, impactful strategies preventing their health problems. Of course, if they appear, there are multiple strategies that we can intervene. And the more we intervene between 10 to 16, that's also important. But the main strategy is really preventing those problems.
So this incredibly important age group, these adolescents who are in a state of higher neuroplasticity, if I understand correctly, than at just about any other time in life, greater volumes and shifts in hormonal activity in the body than at any other stage in life, more changes physically in terms of appearance, size, capacity than at any other stage in life, except for, of course, the earliest childhood. So from a physiological standpoint, there's all kinds of reasons why the anxiety and stress might be so present when those changes are so robust and so quick. But in the past, it seems to me that there was a coherent community within which those changes were taking place, that teenager held a special place, a special status within a well-circumscribed community and was provided for on that basis. Whereas now, as you said, there seems to be this extra layer of anxiety being generated in the lives of teenagers through their comparison with a completely undefined, sort of boundaryless, abstract community. This is, of course, happening online mostly. And the models that they're receiving within which to understand the changes that are happening to them, and perhaps models that become aspirational goals for them, are performative more than they are true or real or lived, as they would be in those former communities. When we talk about how things have changed in the past 25 years, of course, the digital revolution is what comes to mind. Is that sort of how you conceptualize the causes of this new, I won't call it an epidemic, but this rise in these poor mental health and physiological health outcomes for that age group?
Yeah, that's even with the physiologic part, that's true. It's not maybe the when the most changes happening compared to early years, but it's most changing happiness where the adult support control is less. So in the young adult, when the babies, you're more, protected. And it's a really protected environment. I mean, potentially there is protected environment in adolescence as well, but with the changes in the social life, turning to peers, more independence, more thinking about exploring who I am who I want to be with, where I'm going to be in the future, more work on that. So there is less control. I mean, if you think just from the food perspective, nutrition perspective, with the early years, there's this, control in terms of what young baby feeds in terms of healthy food. But in adolescence, it's more young people learn themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that variation as well. I completely agree with the impact of digital transformation. I'm not against digital transformation. That is important. But for young people, for adolescents, because of the developmental stages they're going through, where some boundaries are, large enough boundaries are to some extent helpful to practice adult skills in a safe environment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's lucid,
right?
And so that's a big problem. But mostly it's really what is going on developmentally in them, because that's when they are asking where I'm coming from, who I am now, and where I am going. While answering this question, just feeling like I'm by myself in this journey,
mm-hmm.
versus the whole world is open to me, from my point of view, they're equally detrimental to well-being.
We've been dealing with this concept in one of my classes recently. The how else to explain it? It's to do with boundaries, and the way that we perceive boundaries in our lives. I think the adolescent go-to claim would be, I don't want any walls around me. I want utter freedom. I'm just starting to feel this autonomy that you mentioned. I'm telling stories about meaning in my own life, about my own identity, where I'm headed in this life. I don't want anyone to get in the way of that, or anything to get in the way of that. But there does seem to be a subconscious desire for the knowledge of some sort of, call it a safety net, call it a distant boundary, call it a guardrail, whatever words you want for it, something that reassures that young person, if this story that I'm telling isn't correct, or if things get a bit out of hand with my autonomous exploration of this newly open world, I want to know there's somebody or something there to catch me and set me back on the right course. So we've been talking about this line, we want walls, we just don't want to see them, right? Does that resonate in terms of what you're talking about?
That's very true. That's very true. That's, yeah, exactly. That's why, in terms of what helps as well, we need, young people need at least one person in their lives continuously. So that's one person, potentially not change for, a good amount of time, who they can trust, and they know they can go to them under any circumstances and they can get support.
Is that the sort of secure attachment piece?
Not necessarily.
No.
That should be an attachment figure. So, I mean, if the attachment figure is one of the parents or, a teacher, it can be someone else. But it's someone that they can trust. It might be the school counselor. It might be a teacher in the school. The person might be an older kid from, from the higher grade classes. But someone who is not part of in that young person's life because of carrying obligations like parents. A parent could take this role, but it's ideal that there is another person that young people can trust, exactly for that reason you just explained. Because yes, they want to explore, but that's still a practice.
Yeah.
And that's, they, in some cultures or contexts, because of the availability of resources or systems, in some cultures and contexts, because the way the community is organized, there has always been that safety nets. But we are slowly losing those.
That's exactly where I was headed today. The coherent story that used to be told by one's community and the identity that was a part of that story seems to be, at least in a state of disarray, if not in many cases, I think, non-existent for some people who are growing up with their primary connections being found online. I guess I would describe them as incomplete humans, with a side of a self being presented, but certainly not a whole self, and certainly not one that's attached to that more coherent community. So, in this day and age, it seems like the physical school is uniquely placed to begin restoring some of that coherence to the lives of 10 to 16-year-olds. We can talk for days about growing inequities and lack of access for many, many different groups. We can talk about these massive numbers of students seeking accommodation. The only place that I can think of where that might happen is either a community center, which, as I've mentioned, is not serving the same function that it may have in previous generations, and the school site. So, in as much as that doesn't sound like it's necessarily happening perfectly or anywhere near perfectly right now, what might we prescribe for the traditional school system as we generally understand it, that physical building where young people go from 9 o'clock till 3 or 4 in the afternoon, where they have fairly consistent, dedicated adults teaching them specific subjects, which are, at least in theory, tied to skill sets that they'll need for their later life. If they're not finding community and that coherent story there now, what are some steps that schools might take to begin regenerating that in the lives of especially that 10 to 16-year-old group?
Yeah, I completely agree in terms of the school's key role. I mean, firstly, schools have access to all young people in the community.
Yeah,
that's
uniquely
practical.
So. Yeah.
And the second is they spend a lot of time there, at school in their awakened time. So that from morning to afternoon, more than in the family or elsewhere. And especially with, again, if we're talking about more like adolescents, they are much more interested in being in the school environment with peers anyway. In relation to what schools can do to prevent these issues and to take that role as well, one aspect of well-being really that I haven't mentioned, I should go back to Isaac Protensky's work on mattering. Well-being is just not about us being valued. What I try to say in terms of the well-being of the individual is linked to the well-being of the context they're in. It's not just about me being valued, that I'm important, I'm taken care of in this context, in the school. It's also about how much I give value. I matter, I can contribute to the school. Because that's when I matter. And especially, this is true for every individual being at any age, but especially for young people who are working on their identity and intimacy. The question they ask them, always, do I matter here?
Yeah.
How can I make myself matter? And that's two ways. I need to feel valued. I need to feel like I can give value, contribute to my context. Schools creating these opportunities, not necessarily big things. It might be just simple acts, simple actions that, giving some responsibility to students in the school to run some of the routines, for instance. Having those two feelings will, first of all, will help young people, students individually feel better, and then will improve their sense of belonging to school, because belonging is also interactive. So it's not just about, you're important to us, being able to show that importance in terms of what the young person can do. And that will increase their quality of life, well-functioning, all the outcomes that we want to see as improved. So that's one key relatively, I wouldn't say simple because, simple at the end as an action, but a lot of perspective change at the beginning, of course. But that's one way to start with. Schools exploring ways that students can contribute to school. One example we see a lot in schools is the peer mentoring.
Yeah.
That works very well most of the time. And that's not because of the mentoring side, but also, those kids, older ones, doing something, taking some responsibility, or some committees, or I don't know if they have them. We used to have some clubs running the school, the shop and stuff. So those responsibilities, that makes a huge difference.
It's so important to emphasize because I think this aspect of resilience is somewhat counterintuitive to some. When we look at a young person who is in distress or a young person who's showing poor, let's say, mental health outcomes, one of our adult instincts is to put a bubble around that student, say they must be protected. They're certainly not to have any additional responsibilities put on them right now until we've restored them to a certain level, however we may judge that. They almost get taken out of the community in a sense. They get held away from those mentorship opportunities or from being able to contribute in a more meaningful way. But so importantly, one of the first big lessons I learned on the ground in classrooms in my early years as a teacher was if you have a particularly disruptive student, especially a disruptive male student, one of the best things that you can do for them is to make them responsible for some aspect of the classroom environment or the classroom routine. Give them something that they can call their own, that they're responsible for. And it's amazing to see how they begin regulating themselves, doing a lot of the work that you would have thought of as a teacher or as a parent or an authority was your job to do for them. They start to regulate themselves when they have that bivalenced valuing that you described, feeling internal self-esteem, but also feeling that external recognition and the esteem you get from that. Those terms make me immediately, and I think probably many of our listeners immediately think of Maslow. And Maslow's perhaps the most famous idea in all of psychology, the Maslow's hierarchy, right? It's a 70-year-old at least framework. For the few who may be unfamiliar, we're of course starting at the bottom of that hierarchy with our physiological safety and security needs. The middle piece is that belonging that you just described, which leads to self-esteem. I just described it as having internal and external inputs. And finally, purpose, right? Purpose and purpose leading to self-actualization, which is, I think, what we're prescribing, what we would hope for those 15, 16, 17-year-olds to begin to actualize some of these stories and see how they might contribute to a larger community. Is that 70-year-old concept still going strong? Does it still have a great deal of validity? Can we complicate it a bit now, or has it been complicated to some degree? And does it fit with what you've just described to us as what these 10 to 16-year-olds really need in their lives to build well-being and resilience?
Yeah, I think there are 2 points that you're making with the example you have given with the misbehaving male student and taking responsibility and changing his behaviors and his involvement strategies. Yes, that is what's happening on the observational level, but what's actually happening at the background of it is you as a teacher changing your perspective in terms of defining where the problem is.
I see.
It's not misbehaving was a problem. Now misbehaving is a symptom of something else that you need to change.
Right.
And by giving responsibility, by changing the context of that student, you're actually dealing with that real cause, rather than the symptom. And the symptom disappears. So that's one aspect. So really looking behind the scene, what was the real problem here, and try to define it more in a person-environment interaction level. So rather than labeling the student or the individual, they're misbehaving. they're this, they're that. So that's the actual running mechanism. That is, the perspective shift in terms of defining what the problem is. With going to Maslow's hierarchy, yes, that is true. It's still influential, and like any other models like this, even like it's not that old. Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, the way we define, not necessarily saying about needs and but still talking about from a different perspective, from what impacts how we can change those, how we can fulfill those needs. But again, if you look at what is consistent across these different models, is again the holistic weave. Maslow defined that way. I just can't remember on top of my head, but some other theoreticians, other scholars defined different aspects. Erikson defined as, from into attachment to generosity, or those stages of life where it's to some extent not, of course, same content, but similar hierarchical idea. But all of them at the end say the holistic wave, whether it's hierarchical, whether it's parallel. But the key is that, again, looking at from this, just not about the basics, not just about the self-actualization, not just about self-esteem. It's all of them together. And I wouldn't necessarily can say, based on the research and what I've read, that there is a hierarchy in terms of basics of life needed before self-esteem or before self-actualization. There is some hierarchy there, but I don't think it's linear. It's more, there are cycles, there are, it's complex, potentially self-esteem means, increases in, fulfilling our needs in relation to self-actualization will bring other needs under other categories of that hierarchy. So I don't necessarily, I'm not convinced enough yet that it's a hierarchy, but me, it's the holistic wave of those models that is really telling us the problem as well, because when we intervene, we just go one piece is in it. Yeah. And those models tells us that no, we need all of them.
Yeah. We seem to be, as a culture, maybe even as a global culture, struggling, scrabbling our way up a very difficult challenge of moving out of this medicalized deficit thinking model of the human being, where we almost treat it like a car, right? Let's look, the car's not working, so let's look for the one piece under the hood that may be broken. Let's put something new in there or repair it and expect for the whole system to work perfectly again. That's just not how a human works. And I'm so pleased that you've really emphasized the holistic. I want to just re-emphasize something that Carl Rogers, I think, would have held up above all other things when dealing with children, approaching them with that attitude of unconditional positive regard, this regard for them as a full human being who is not broken and who deserves to be listened to, whose opinion deserves to be taken seriously and considered, and whose situation deserves to be met not with judgment, but only with compassion and love. And that, in a lot of cultures, in my culture, perhaps in yours as well, many, even quite recently, that approach may have been called soft, right? We may have said that's going to make a non-resilient student. That's going to make a weak adult, ultimately. If they continue to only be met with love, where's the stick? Where's the consequence, right? And yet, certainly Carl Rogers, one of the most influential clinicians of the past 100 years, but just about every researcher that I'm talking with these days within education and within psychology saying the same thing about needing a trusted adult who does not bring judgment, but rather brings a willing ear, perhaps even additional supports, but certainly an acceptance of the authentic individual. an acceptance of the whole individual. I know we're running out of time here, so I want to make sure we get to your current research and perhaps how some of these ideas that we've been circling around is fitting into. I know you're doing a lot of work with community resilience, and then some of these longitudinal studies around evaluation processes. What are you seeing in your most recent research, and how does it relate to these ideas of approaching the holistic person?
Yeah. And my current work is really bringing what you just described in terms of what we should be, moving forward, and to practice this. Schools is the best place to deal with this.
Mm.
It's this is not typical. Schools. In any country, any place, schools already having a lot to deal. They have a lot in their plates, with the expectations from the government, from everywhere, with the current changes. And my goal is not to put any more responsibility to schools, but more to help understand policymakers to direct their resources, financial or not, to support schools more from a prevention perspective, and build those communities within the schools that can provide to students.
Mm.
So that, bring that extra support to schools that they can, to some extent, navigate in the way they need it, rather than we are doing this, we're implementing this intervention in all schools in our, area, but providing the resources. And that's kind of the starting point of my current research. I mean, in the last 6-7 years, really, working with the local governments, and in collaboration with the local governments, work with the schools, primary and secondary schools in that area, and help schools to get the support they need from local government. That might be in terms of facilitation, so like human capital, or it might be financial support, or it might be some negotiating some what needs to happen and what to prioritize, and help schools to first understand what's going on in our school. What are the things that we're doing as a school that really helps our students and ourselves, our staff, our system, school climate, our students, do an audit of their school.
Mm.
But it's not someone else is coming and doing it. There might be an external facilitator just to set up this, the scene, but it's more schools themselves understanding what is going on in our school, reflect on their experiences, which is not, with all the dynamic and the workload, we don't have time in schools to reflect.
Yeah.
Give that time, and also understand what, to learn about our student populations. What are the general issues in our student populations? This is being done. This is done in schools a lot, but generally on a topic base, different teams, not as a whole, as a whole school community. This is easier with some small schools, but large secondary schools, it might be some representatives from each group. Of course, there's different ways to do that, but it's really that the key is doing this together, because these are all things that already, actions that either schools are responsible to do, or they're already doing it, but it's the way it's done together. And then from there on, it's really identifying what is next. What can we do? Taking some actions, where generally the local governments or local support becomes important, and implementing those actions. So we practice this as a large local area. In one of them, there was around 36 schools, in the other one in 44 schools, including primary and secondary schools, in 2 areas in England. north of England in 2 different local areas. And it was impressive to see. It was amazing to see the difference in terms of how, first of all, schools started to talk about student problems and their school experiences, which we know from other research is going to influence their behavior and it's going to influence student outcomes. And some of the schools even we didn't expect to see, because this is a big kind of a system level change, we can't expect to see the impact on student well-being or success or life satisfaction, school satisfaction immediately. So it will take some time. So we didn't even expect to see that, but even there we were seeing some improvements as well immediately, which were, I'm assuming that the mechanism there, again, students being involved in this process as well. It's not just the school stuff, it's students as well being involved. And the key there was, which I didn't start my journey thinking about this, but now after doing all this research, realizing staff well-being was the biggest mediator.
Wow.
Because when staff well-being and staff resilience, their relationship with their work, their relationship with each other, their relationship with the leadership, and workload, morale, appraisals, there are different aspects to that well-being, of course, but that's the key.
Staff well-being.
It's not something we study a lot. It's not something that is mentioned a lot.
That's right.
Staff well-being is the key to to start making changes in schools. Because again, it's not just about staff being high well-being. Staff well-being is a very good summative summary of what else is going on in school. Staff well-being means there's good, supportive leadership. There's good school climate. So it is a very summary indication of a lot of other system level factors in school, and therefore student outcomes as well. Yes, and that's one aspect, staff well-being. The other one I want to mention is really within these programs, what we have done is another concept that I borrowed from public health literature is targeted universalism, or some others called proportionate universalism. So when we start to work on the school, again, we're taking a holistic approach. It's not just working in a specific group. Those who have behavior problems, let's do some mindfulness training. Let's do some anger management, assertiveness. Just giving examples from different interventions I did myself, practiced myself in schools in the past. They are of course helpful, they're of course important, but just doing them without doing something with everyone is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
That's I think the key point. So we need to do something with everyone. So the universal aspect, the basics, resilience building intervention, or some psychoeducational intervention it can be, or something, and then provide extra support to those who need that extra support. So that's what I mean by targeted universalism. That way we change the whole school system, but also minimize the gap between those who are facing extra challenges in life. So, and that equality then brings the well-being of everyone else. So bringing back to the very first point.
That final point, I hope everyone heard that loud and clear, because it points in a direction towards authentic community in schools, which I think is what we all need to be pulling towards these days. You've caught me out a little bit talking about staff indicators, staff health indicators and well-being and staff resilience. I think up until now, I have been thinking in a fairly fragmented way about school health in general, and have been putting most, if not all, of my emphasis on student well-being. And I think almost thinking of staff well-being as something that could, and in some cases should, be sacrificed for student well-being. But I'm seeing in your conversation and in the points, in the attitude even that has infused this entire conversation, that staff well-being, student well-being, community well-being are in fact all expressions of the same dynamic, the same integrated whole.
It's the same house, from which window you're looking in.
That may end up being the title of this episode. For those who are hoping to dig a little bit deeper and maybe observe some of what you observed in your studies of, was it 44 schools in England?
Yeah, so that is Blackpool's Head Start program called Resilience Revolution. There are, information, the forms, reports are available, the actions on the social media as well as their websites as well. So the Resilience Revolution Blackpool Head Start program, that's one of them. I think that has a lot of examples of what can be practiced and what the research, the evaluation of those interventions says. I think that's a very good example. It's a very big project where, it has lots of pieces to it, but it's, I think, a good illustration of how we can make a town-wide system change, really.
Any other resources or sites that you'd like to highlight before I let you go today?
I think I really like, and I think it's important as linked to school experiences as well, Isaac Pultenski's work on mattering and well-being. I think that's in the more from a human development, community psychology interaction, really. I think that's an important work. Michael Unger has been writing or editing books about more systemic perspectives to resilience. So that's another resource. I think that actually that book is freely available online. Those are the main ones.
Well, I hope I don't ever overstep when I say, in keeping with Isaac Pultenski's focus, you matter an awful lot to me and to a lot of folks who are trying to understand these concepts better. I hope your voice is heard loud and clear by our listeners, and especially your message about holism and making sure that we are bringing a sense of belonging and a sense that I matter to the lives of our students, the lives of our families, and the lives of our communities. Dr. Suna, thank you so much for being with me today. You've been a joy to talk to, and I have so much more to learn.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Braemar Life Skills Academy. Tune in for our next 2 episodes where we'll continue our focus on resilience. Till then, I'm your host, Mike Helsby, looking forward to more conversations along the education journey.